Hi, I'm attorney Renee Osipov with Chelle Law, and we assist parents, guardians, and students who are having issues surrounding 504 plans and the accommodations therein. In this video, I'm kind of walking you through the whole process of requesting a 504 plan, what it's going to look like, and the accommodations themselves for a student with a diagnosis of ADHD. So, to start off with, if you're a parent or guardian and you feel like your student is struggling and perhaps having characteristics of ADHD, and you're thinking maybe they need some type of accommodations in the classroom in order for them to not have those difficulties. So the first step, in my opinion, would be to go ahead and get a diagnosis. So this can happen from a specialist, from your primary care provider, or also some types of therapist. But I think it's important to kind of start there. So if you feel like there may be some type of ADHD sort of characteristics, I would go ahead and consult with a healthcare provider. Now, the parents may be seeing this, or you may be hearing observations from the general education classroom teacher as well. So they are familiar with the diagnosis, and if they're seeing those key characteristics, they may suggest as well. So in order to get a 504 plan for a student who has a diagnosis of ADHD, the student needs to get an actual diagnosis from a healthcare provider. Now, once that happens, then I would reach out to the school and let them know of the diagnosis, and then request the student to be evaluated to see if they would receive accommodations in a 504 plan. Now, 504 plans are federal law. They're codified in federal statutes, and it's very clear in order for a student to get those services provided to them, they have to have a substantial, let me backtrack. The law states that they have to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life event. So if we're talking about ADHD specifically, this would fall under the mental impairment. And then the teacher and the parents and healthcare providers can establish if there is a substantial impairment within the classroom. So at that point, the 504 plan team would actually meet, and that would include the parent or guardian. At that time, they would decide, okay, it does look like the student does qualify for the 504 plan. And in some of my other videos, I've walked through the process of the student being evaluated and what that looks like. So feel free to check those out as well. But it would be then likely that the team would say that the child does qualify for a 504 plan. So at this point in time, we've established that they have a diagnosis, they have a mental impairment, it's substantially limiting them in the classroom. Now we would go to the part where the student would then receive accommodations. So 504 plans, this is really what they're there for, accommodations. So when the team is writing these, they're going to look at several things. When during the day are these impairments showing up? So is this when the teacher is giving instruction itself? Is it when they're working independently on assignments? Or is it when the teacher is giving exams or tests? Or maybe it's all of the above. The possibilities are really endless for 504 plans. That's a good thing about them is you can get very creative on the accommodations to meet the specific unique needs of each student. So let's talk about what those accommodations might look like, and we can kind of break that down into the different categories. So first we can talk about general instruction. So when the teacher's up in front of the class giving a general instruction for math, science, reading, any of those things, is the student being substantially impaired during that time? So accommodations could be that potentially that the student could sit at the front of the class. So there's less distractions, they can focus in. Also, sometimes students need sort of sensory tools, so moving their hands or feet and having tools to do that would then allow them to quiet their body but focus their mind. So those are sensory tools that could be written in for the accommodations as well. Perhaps listening to the teacher give the instruction and taking notes is too much for them. So the accommodation for this, depending on the grade level, would either be that the teacher would then provide notes to the student, or maybe someone in the class is writing notes and they would give those to the teacher, who would then give a copy to the student. Those are all sort of examples of ways that the general instruction can be accommodated for that student. Now we can talk about just general assignments. So day-to-day assignments, how can those accommodations be written? So I think the most important thing to think about if a student has a diagnosis of ADHD is it can be very overwhelming for them if an educator tells them to go to their seat, open up and do the 10 pages of work. That's going to be completely overwhelming to them. So there is accommodation called chunking, which is kind of a silly name, but it really does mean that the work is just chunked up into smaller pieces. So this could be the teachers circling specific questions that they want the student to do and then checking back in with the teacher after those are completed. Or sometimes the teacher just gives the student, maybe a page at a time, and once it's completed, then they'll hand that back in to the educator. And then lastly, accommodations to kind of think about are exams. So these are stressful times, and especially if a student has ADHD, they're already going to have anxiety on top of their focusing issues. And so a lot of times, I would say the most common accommodations for students with ADHD are around exams. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. The first one would be extended time. So it may be double or triple the time of other students in the class. So if an exam is typically an hour, they would be given 2 or 3 hours, and the accommodation would be written to specify that. Probably actually the most common would be that the student would be allowed to take the exam in a quiet area outside of the classroom. This is going to help them focus, and there's going to be less stimuli around the room. Sometimes the exam can be read to them. It really depends on if that's what's causing their focusing issues, if it's like sitting and reading. Again, the chunking of the exam, so maybe the teacher just breaks it down page by page. And so those are all kind of ways that it can be broken down so that a student who has ADHD can really flourish inside the classroom. A couple of things I do want to sort of note. It's important in the accommodations that they're written in a way that the student isn't necessarily singled out. So, it would be that they were just given extended time. They shouldn't have to ask for it. Things like that, so that the educator knows and the student knows. And or another example would be if another student or one of their peers is taking notes for them, instead of handing the notes directly to that student, maybe it goes to the teacher, and the teacher does not disclose what student in the class needs those notes. So things like that can really help a student who has accommodations feel more comfortable, especially with ADHD accommodations that I had already discussed. So if you'd like more information, our contact information is in the description below. We are happy to help if you feel that your student would like to be evaluated for a 504 plan, or you feel like they already have one, but the accommodations just really aren't meeting their needs. We're happy to help, and we're very familiar with the process. Thanks.